So now, having framed the conversation a bit, I'm excited to be joined by three celebrated members and experts of the law enforcement community. We're very lucky to have these three leaders. Chief Cassandra Brown of the Raleigh Police Department, John Monahan, Director of Partnerships at All Aces Incorporated. And I just want to check quickly if Michelle Bryan has been able to join us yet. Michelle, are you there? Okay.
Hey, this is Montreal. I'm supporting Ms. Bryan from the Federal Protective Service. I did ping her, so I'll give you an update if she's able to join.
Okay, that's wonderful.
Okay,
thank you.
Sure.
Okay. Michelle Bryan, Deputy Director of Resource Management and Strategy and Policy at the Department of Homeland Security. We look forward to having her a little bit later in the webinar. What we were going to do, as I mentioned, is we were going to take questions from the audience. There's usually a as I said, there's usually a Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen in Zoom webinars, but we're going to have to rely on this chat, on the chat feature. And so if you have a question as we're working through many of the questions that I'm going to pose to panelists that you'd like to have answered, be sure to put that in the chat box. And then as we get to the end of the webinar, if there's time, I'd like to take some questions from the audience and offer them to the panelists as well. So I guess just to get things started, I thought a lot about how I'd like to introduce my panelists, but I actually think that it would be more informative, and certainly informative for me, for the panelists to introduce themselves a little bit more. So, first question is can each of you give us a quick introduction and tell us a little bit about what you do? Chief Brown, I know that a lot of people think that being the chief of police is self-explanatory, but I think that there are a lot of people that just don't know the ins and outs of your job and the demands on leadership that you have. So you could even include just a little bit of information about that. And if it's relevant, offer some of the experience that you have in law enforcement leading up to your current position. We'll start with Chief Brown, please.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for inviting me to be a part of this greater discussion. I am Cassandra Brown. I've been the chief of police in the city of Raleigh, which is the capital city for the state of North Carolina, since 2013. So right at almost 7.5 years. I have been a member of the Raleigh Police Department for a total of 33 years. I started right out of college, so I've had the opportunity to serve in every supervisory position and ultimately hold the position here as police chief. To say these are unprecedented times, I think is an understatement for a lot of us who are pretty much on the front lines. And what we're seeing, I think, is I think we're at a crossroad. So I think when you talk about leadership, leadership is going to look, I think, somewhat differently in the future. But the innovation of how we police is going to be reflective of that leadership in a number of ways as well. COVID-19 has clearly made and left a thumbprint on our city and our state. And we, of course, are dealing with the riots as other cities have. And both of those, I think, have handed us opportunities to really explore where we go from preparedness all the way up to really being a change agent in in how we police and how we lead our cities. So I'm sure other parts of what I do and how I got to this position will come out over the course of this discussion. But thank you for allowing me to be here.
Thank you, Chief Dick Brown. John Monahan, can you offer an introduction and give us an idea about some of the work that you're engaged in?
Sure. So I am a retired police chief. I began my career, my whole career has been in New Hampshire, but it began as a city police officer in Lebanon. And from there, I was a state trooper for about 10 years. And in 2012, I moved over to a very small town in northern New Hampshire called Franconia, where I was the chief for 5 years. And after that, I went to a small town in the Lakes region called Moultonborough, where I finished out my career as the chief of police there. I retired, and so in 2014, 2015, during the first, I would call it rounds of this being uncovered of the shooting of unarmed Black men when Black Lives Matter was created, I really began to pay attention to the community's relationship with their police departments, and started to educate myself about some of the systems that are at play and why this was bubbling to the surface, and it concerned me deeply. So I began educating myself in racial equity work, and upon retiring, I went to work for All Aces Inc., which is a racial equity, diversity, and inclusion firm in Boston. So I do this work full time, and I'm sort of on the other side of the fence now. And so I find myself today very uniquely situated that I'm a professional in the racial equity world, having spent 20 years in the police world.
Yeah, so let me stay with John for just a moment for this next question. So I'm thinking about these twin problems that I kind of laid out in the opening of my own remarks of coronavirus and this unprecedented times, this pandemic, and then the mass protests that we're witnessing still on a daily basis. What do you see? I mean, how do you frame, or what's salient for you in terms of the most serious challenges that you're facing, or that law enforcement in general is facing right now? What is right at the forefront of what's the issue that most urgently needs to be resolved?
I'll start by saying that COVID and the protests have basically pulled the covers back on problems that we've been facing for a very, very long time. And it's simply put a magnifying glass on them and amplified them for our society. And I will also say that, there are different people that there are protesters, there are looters, and there are rioters, and we shouldn't lump them all in the same category. So there's different voices that are speaking that need to be heard. And so the work of law enforcement, in my personal opinion, is to listen. We need to listen to our communities because it's very loud and very clear right now. And I think the challenge is going to be, how do we create a dialogue where both sides can come together and have a real true discussion. And I would call it truth and reconciliation to some degree about this relationship between minoritized or underserved communities, underrepresented communities, and the police and different public services that serve them. And so I think that's the challenge at hand. And the biggest challenge of that is where and how do we create a space where this dialogue can exist and move forward.
Yeah. Chief Dick Brown, what's the most urgent issue issues that you're facing right now in your own terms in Raleigh?
Well, obviously, the protest and responding to those protests, but also recognizing in the middle of all of this is the voice. As John, if I may call you by your first name, as John just mentioned, you know, it has clearly, I think, pulled covers off of a lot of issues. One is the impact of communities of color from a health disparity standpoint, as well as what we've seen across the country for a while as it relates to race. And to start the conversation off about what we saw in Minneapolis is horrifying for all of us, and particularly those of us who wear the badge. This is not something that is acceptable by anyone in law enforcement that I've had conversations with, and the various memberships that I've been a member of for quite some time have found the act very appalling. And so what it's also done is made us look at very short-term, immediate things to address, but then also looking at long-term. And the long-term is that overall response to how do we get to a better place as a country and as a nation, and while in the midst of trying to heal our communities and reform, and I've said it a couple of times here in our city, reform, while we want everything to come from a federal and a national level. And I think that this is going to be that moment when some of that's going to happen. But I also think that some of that reform has to start within our own respective houses. And so it begins by, you know, self-evaluation in what we're doing as agencies in taking some preliminary steps in order to get us further down the road as well. But recognizing we are at a crossroad, and decisions and changes are going to have to be made.
Yeah, so I hear both of you talking about decisions and changes that need to be made, and listening, I think, to the people who have been hit hardest by coronavirus, or the people who have been hit hardest by police brutality, often communities of color. So I'm going to push just a little bit on that. I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on how do we reduce or eliminate this gap? The experiences that whites report having with police are very different than the experiences Black Americans report having with police. In a sense, it's two different Americas. But that's also true with how coronavirus has ravished these communities. What are some of the hard decisions? I mean, a little bit more specifically, I think that the response definitely needs to happen at many different levels, as Chief Deck Brown just alluded to. But if you could be more specific of policies that are maybe immediately under your control, or policies that you would like to promote, what are some of those changes that you really advocate putting forward so that we can reduce this disparity? Chief Deck Brown?
Well, say, first of all, it didn't start with these recent incidents in our department. Now, are we a perfect department? Absolutely not. But, you know, beginning to have the dialogue, the community relationships, the partnerships, the crucial conversations that speak to the history of policing. You know, for those criminal justice folk who are on this call, we know when we talk about the Peelian principles, we talk about Sir Robert Peel, that he was pushing that memo out in the 1820s about what really is reflective of community policing today. But in America, we were entrenched in slave patrol at the same time. And so I think we have to speak to the history of policing and how it has not always served those of us who try to wear the badge honorably. It hasn't always served us well. And when we look at our history and many names, not just the very recent ones, but historically, you know, we can set a timeline and identify those various incidents across the country over decades that have impacted us in ways that we have to address. And what that looks like has to be more than conversation. And it also has to be, as I mentioned, those immediate things. Those are the things that are in my control. One of the things that I presented yesterday, actually before our council, is taking a look at Campaign Zero and the 8 Can't Wait. And they actually did a scoring of the various departments throughout the country. 5 of the 8, our department had policy and was had implemented over the years. The other 3 need to be shored up, such as the ban on chokeholds. And while we had a policy that spoke to chokeholds and strangleholds clearly being deadly force and advising against the use of it, we needed to do more. So yesterday, part of my presentation to the council was also to absolutely ban it as well. And so I think it starts with there again, recognizing where those areas are within our own organizations where we can make those immediate changes. But it also has to involve the greater community as well in that dialogue, and how we work to fix the wrongs that have happened, not just through this, but beyond, and where do we go? And it takes a collective community, I think, to do that. And so I have, I've stated that I am more than willing to work in that regard. And it has to be many facets in the community. We often hear from one group, but there are many people in my city and others who have sat and watched. And so one of the requests that I've had to our community is stand in that gap as well. And I've reached out to our faith leaders and many others who see a need, and I think now more than ever they see that need.
Yeah, that's powerful. Thank you. John Monahan, what are your thoughts about specific policies that really need to take precedence and pushed forward in terms of reducing some of that gap that we see between white communities and Black communities?
I think, one thing is to recognize, as Chief Deck Brown mentioned, the historical aspects. So, for example, the practice of redlining and segregation that occurred that disproportionately affected communities of color and allowed white communities to live in places where generational wealth was accumulated. The effect of that is, I think, in a big part why we are seeing communities of color disproportionately affected by the coronavirus, their access to healthcare, food deserts, and things of that nature are just, they are still rearing their ugly heads, even though many of those things were repealed in the 60s. The effects of them have not been fixed. So the law or the rule has gone away, but the effect has not. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that. That doesn't, of course, change where we are right now. And so, but understanding that context, I think, helps us understand the system that got us to where we are today. And so similar to the chief, in New Hampshire, we have one police academy, and in other states, there's several police academies. And so in New Hampshire, we don't even teach or train or condone chokeholds. Like, that's just not a thing here. So, and I went over the 8 Can't Wait list, and I think about 4 of them have been already addressed. It's just the way business is done in New Hampshire. And then another 4 need to be looked at and refined and addressed. And it'll be interesting to see what the New Hampshire Police Academy does do with that. And so I'm eagerly watching from the sidelines at this point in my career. And then there's the federal level. So speaking to that, New Hampshire has one police academy. That police academy is responsible for holding the certificates of every officer in New Hampshire. So if they are arrested, if they violate a rule of conduct or are fired, that disciplinary hearing is done through the New Hampshire Police Academy rather than perhaps a department that would hold a certification in another state. And so I think the federal piece of this is understanding on a nationwide level, what is the standard to become a police officer? What is the standard to become certified, to hold that certification? And what is the standard to remove that certification if you are not, doing what you need to do to be a productive member of not just your police department, but your community? And so that, I think, is more of a federal discussion that could happen. So we can see some more standardization across law enforcement, not just town to town or county to county or state to state, but nationwide. I think that's an important.
Yeah, I hear a lot of the discussion about the protests and police brutality centering around holding police accountable in ways that they haven't been held accountable before. And I don't think that that's the silver bullet answer, but it certainly seems to be something that needs some amount of attention and focus. And I wonder what each of your thoughts are on police accountability and maybe an inability to hold police accountable because of protection from unions, or if you have any thoughts on that. Chief Deck Brown?
Well, North Carolina is a right-to-work state. So we aren't as embedded, if you will, with unions. However, we do have police associations. So the chiefs and the executives within those organizations have a lot more control and latitude within their respective agencies as well. I've had conversations with other peers in union-type states, and with the arbitration and so many other things that come into play, it can impact how things are done. But I think when we talk about accountability, everyone has an obligation to do the right thing, particularly in the roles that we have. And we have Raleigh's not much different than some of the other cities where we have been involved in officer-involved incidents where they have been shootings and or fatal shootings. The tragedy impacted by that it is across the board. It impacts the community, it impacts the organization, and the officers that are involved as well as their families. And so when we look at accountability, when we look at all of those circumstances, I think we also have to look at, how do we get to that point of engagement on both sides? What gets us there? And we know that while police officers, law enforcement are often on the most obvious side of it, what leads up to that? So when we're talking about disparities within communities, it's economic, it's race, it's gender, the laundry list of biases, but it's also housing, it's other services. COVID-19 afforded all of us to see really what homeschooling looks like. And here in the county in which we live, in order to ensure continuity of learning, and this is the week where kids would normally walk across the stage here in our public school system. So virtual graduations are underway throughout our state. But what raised its head once again, even for our school system, was the reality that an inequity existed when it came to interoperability. So you had our connectivity. You had families that did not have computer access. So you had kids who did not have the ability to even do virtual learning or any type of online learning at all. So our county actually provided every child in our county with a notebook and a hotspot in the event they didn't have it. Well, it gave our educators also an opportunity to see that child and to place eyes on those children. The sad and unfortunate reality here is our child abuse cases went up as well. And so and we know what that's about. You know, these kids are now at home, and there still is a lot of frustration because our numbers have gone up with COVID-19, and probably will go up even more following these protests. And so when we are looking at accountability, I think, you know, government has to look at accountability as well. Law enforcement is not the only piece of that puzzle. There's a much greater piece to it. And you mentioned food deserts. Food deserts typically happen in or occur in communities of color. And then you can go to another side of our city and you have supermarkets and grocery stores within a block or two of each other. They're plentiful and abundant. So accessibility creates those aspects as well that speak to accountability. And there again, I'm back to, you know, we're at that crossroad. And I think I actually had a conversation with my department. He had peers this morning on a call very similar to this. And it was emotional for one, because there are folk who don't really know what role they have right now. But it afforded us to just be very authentic with each other in recognizing, particularly in the roles that we have in government, whether it's policing or solid waste services or public utilities. You know, here's that opportunity to further explore who we're reaching and who we are providing services to in the most equitable manner. It's not going to come without some very crucial conversations. And they're going to be difficult conversations for all of us. But I think that also stands to help heal the process, where we just happen to be standing in this moment in time. We know that many of the issues that we are facing as a country that speak to disparity began well before many of us were even born.
Yeah. You know, one of the threads that I want to pull out from, I think, a point that both of you have been making is, and I'm kind of putting it in my own words to some extent here, but just how important the relationship is between law enforcement and public safety professionals more generally, and just average members of the public, and how fostering trust between those two groups is an essential part of overcoming some of these challenges and grievances. You know, when I think about trust specifically, there's certainly been, particularly in communities of color, but not strictly communities of color, a lack of trust in law enforcement. And so to some extent, the challenge is to find ways to foster that trust again, which is not, it takes a bit of an art, and it takes time, and it takes listening. It's not something you can legislate. You know, you can't make people trust you or see you as a legitimate force for good in their community. There are, of course, issues of trust that have come up too with the pandemic. And here I'm talking about all of the misinformation that was being spread about the pandemic, both just among people who were kind of on a rumor mill, but also I think from national leadership at times spread some misinformation, and that's reduced trust. I can't tell you how many people I encountered on my Facebook feed talking about what the government was trying to do in a vaccine that they might get, and the surveillance. And so I've seen that one of the impacts of this moment that we're all feeling is this erosion, this current erosion of trust. And I just know that that's really central for law enforcement and their effectiveness to help people in communities. So my question is, and I'll go to John Monahan, what are your thoughts on on how important trust is. I think I just offered a lot, but if you have additional thoughts. And I wonder if you can provide any thoughts of your own thoughts about the kind of roadmap for how trust might be bolstered and in some cases restored between law enforcement and the community, or between government maybe as a larger question, and local communities.
Thank you. Trust is everything. And if you didn't have it at the beginning of this, then you certainly don't have it now. And trust is the kind of thing that's like a bank account, and it's during difficult times that you need to make withdrawals. And so if you haven't been making deposits, then you're in big trouble. And that comes from, you know, community policing. It comes from practicing procedural justice. It comes from having relationships with different diverse members of your community, you know, church members and community organizations and activists in a broad group of people. You know, and so the Chief Deck Brown mentioned the escalation of child abuse, and part of that is because teachers are one of our best reporters of child abuse, and when kids aren't in school, it's not being seen and it's not being reported. So parts COVID and is part of the system was taken away from us that made us being able to protect certain vulnerable members of our community possible. And so we're seeing the effects of that. And it's showing us the vulnerabilities of our systems that we have in place to be able to take care of the people who need us to take care of them. You know, as far as police brutality goes, you know, when I became the chief of Franconia, there had been a shooting there about 5 years prior between an officer and a man, and they both died. And 5 years later, there was still a big old chasm between those who trusted the police and those who didn't. And it was my job to bridge that gap. And I did that by going out and talking to everybody that I could possibly go out and talk to and reach out and mostly listen. And that is one of the steps of procedural justice. I didn't even know what procedural justice was when I started doing this. I just knew it was important to go talk to people who were hurting. If they were willing to talk to me, and if they weren't, I needed to be respectful of that. And so, you know, it's, and, you know, Chief Deck Brown is in charge of a much larger department than I have ever been in charge of. I mean, I think the largest department I was in charge of had 12 people in it, you know, for police officers, which is average for the United States. Most departments are that big. But that kind of department, you can really reach out and touch somebody on a very local level. And, you know, when you're policing such a large community, that is more challenging. And I can't speak to that because I don't have that experience, but I know it is about infusing a culture in your department. And there was a great op-ed written in the Washington Post, and the man who wrote it said, we focused too much on what we were fighting against instead of what we were fighting for. In that gap is where the rock grew. And it was a very poignant and well-pointed line that I think that we should all pay attention to, is what are we fighting for? And to change our focus, because I think, you know, policies like stop, pat, and frisk, which were disproportionately used in places like New York City, in communities of color, that's where a lot of damage was done. And you know, since then, New York City has really revamped their training practices and their policing practices, and that has changed dramatically. The effect on the community, now that's going to take a while to come back around again. And so that is the job of policing, and that's where trust takes time. And incidents like George Floyd absolutely shatters that trust, not just in Minnesota, but across the nation. And actually, we're seeing it across the world.
Chief Deck Brown, given your perspective and having a much larger department, how do you approach building trust with the community, or what's important here that we should know about?
Well, John actually hit on it. Sometimes it really doesn't matter the size of the agency. You cannot build trust in the middle of the crisis. It's too late. So you do have to make routine deposits, if you will, into that savings account. And when those crises happen, then more likely than not, a lot of those relationships that you have built, where you are still able to communicate across the aisles and have conversation, those folk will come to rally and support you in that cause. And so that relationship building is an ongoing process because of police mistrust across the country. And when situations like what happened in Minneapolis occur, regardless of the number of steps you've taken forward, you're pushed back a little bit in terms of losing some ground. But also, you know, I think we're all at a point where we have to prove what we say. And we've got to show discerning and intentionality about making a true difference in our community. When you talk about how you build that relationship, I don't think there's a single roadmap because every community, big or small, has its own personality. Every agency has its own personality. And in the United States, we're roughly around 18,000 law enforcement agencies across the country. Half of those have less than 25 officers. So while you can have the quaintest of towns, you also have metro cities that are beyond one's imagination, and how you push that relationship building out there is it has to be the mindset and the philosophy of everybody that works in that organization. I can't be everywhere all the time as chief, and you do find yourself in one community meeting saying something, and you're in another community meeting or several in the same week. And what you realize is every time you speak, it's a different body of people. So there's a continuous learning opportunity and engagement opportunity, but there's typically no big way to just push that out. Because even if you make it virtual, somebody's going to miss the message, and you're still finding yourself saying, well, these are the programs we have, or this is what we're trying to do. And so that restoration is going to be huge going forward, I do believe. And there again, when you talk about the cultural differences within communities, we've got to have a department that represents that community and understands that community, but looks like that community to some degree as well. You know, for years we've used the word, you know, melting pots, but probably many of our communities that are progressive probably look more like a salad bowl, in that every single leaf of lettuce, tomato, etc., is standing on its own merit. And understanding the people within that community is better aided when you've got people on the force that look like that. Now, are we in a challenging time for recruiting law enforcement officers across this country? Absolutely, we are. And we didn't just get there. It's been a challenge because of the national climate for a while. And so what typically I've seen in my time as a police officer and even as a chief is when these crises happen, one or two things several things will happen. There will be individuals within our own respective organizations that have decided enough is enough and I'm out. And then we will have those who, then you'll have folk in the community who may have contemplated going into law enforcement and now have decided they want no parts of it. And then you'll have those folk who believe that in order to be a part of the change that they want to see in this world, that they need to sign up and step into that role. And so we will see a combination of things, but it's almost like burning the candle at both ends. You're losing people out the door, and you're trying your best to do everything you can do to market to get people in who are diverse and who have more of the guardian mindset. I think what we're seeing is the warrior mindset, and there are several programs out there where we've even offered Blue Courage within our own department that speaks to understanding the different dynamics of being the warrior versus the guardian and having that mindset. And I think the guardian mindset is needed more now than ever in policing.
I like that. That's I had not come across that term, but I think that that's an excellent way of framing the kind of culture that, you know, police departments, I think, are trying to cultivate, a guardian mindset as opposed to a warrior mindset. I'm going to paraphrase a question that we have from one of the attendees here, and I think it's pretty closely related to some of the comments that have already been made here. But I think both panelists here are aware of this idea of implicit bias, or sometimes called unconscious bias. And just by its very definition, it's of course this idea that a lot of the kind of routine ways in which we engage with people, based on race and gender and age, there's some of these routine decisions and small decisions that we make during those engagements are really driven by unconscious biases that we may have, racist biases, ageist biases, and what have you. The thing about this implicit bias discussion and the concern about implicit bias is it's a really hard thing to kind of train out of law enforcement, and just to deal with more generally. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that. John Monahan, do you have any thoughts about implicit bias?
I have deep and profound thoughts about implicit bias that is real. And I actually have Jennifer Eberhardt's book. I'm halfway through it now. It's an excellent book if you haven't read it. And that implicit bias is everywhere, not just in policing. We all have it. And interestingly, I was just making notes about PERF's Rethinking Use of Force is a great article to read, Police Executive Research Forum. And it's also mentioned in the President's 21st Century Report on Policing, is looking at how police officers, they have models for how we can retrain our police officers. And one of the pieces of that is to teach them to think critically. And one piece of teaching people to think critically, in order to be a critical thinker, you have to be self-reflective. And in order to be self-reflective, you have to be mindful, and you have to be able to have good feedback, and you have to have a mechanism in which you can look at your mistakes and faults and learn from them and grow, which bleeds into Robert Keegan's work of the development of the adult mind. And there's 3 different stages of development. And the first is the socialized mind. And I think that that's what we bump into when we saw a lot of implicit bias. It's people who are stuck in a groupthink mentality. And his next stage of thinking is the self-authoring mind. And then there's the self-transcendent mind. Anyways, it's a lot of research there. But people who are able to get to that self-authoring mindset, those are critical thinkers. Those are people who are able to go outside of their assumptions and look at them and try to decide, is what I'm seeing correct and real? And in the President's 21st Century of Policing, they look at European, mostly English and Scottish national decision-making models, and they call it, for their purposes, critical decision-making models. And the first step in that is to assess the situation. And so if you have implicit bias and you're assessing a situation, you are assessing it incorrectly. And so if you are a critical thinker who has a developed mind, then you're going to see the world and yourself more clearly, and you're going to assess that situation more clearly. And so how we do that in policing, I have no idea. I mean, I think that that needs deep and long research, and it needs to be measured, and it needs to be worked on. I did talk to Luann Pinella from LAPD's Police Academy, and I asked her, how do you train your new officers to be critical thinkers? And she said that they put them through ever increasingly challenging scenarios that it causes them to not just learn about policing and police work, but it causes them to have to think critically and to have to reflect critically on what they were good at and what they weren't good at. And it causes their peers to be able to critique them, which starts to create a culture of speaking up and feedback. And so I think if we can head in that direction, and I don't know all the answers, but I think that would go a long way to developing police officers into being members who can start to they can fully see the humanity in themselves, and they can see the full humanity in the people that they're called to serve. And if you can see the humanity in somebody, then people like George Floyd will never die.
Yeah, we have at the University of Maryland, we have now we're using virtual reality tools that put officers in a very realistic environment and is actually able to quantify and gauge implicit biases that they may have based on the scenario that they're encountering in virtual reality. And we can measure things like heart rate. So that's been one attempt at trying to get at implicit bias. But I like kind of this higher level idea of a critical thinking approach that involves education and empathy, and then hopefully that becomes a foundation for informing some of the unconscious biases as well. Chief Deck Brown, I'm wondering if implicit bias is something that that you've thought about as chief, or if it comes up as an issue for you.
Absolutely, and we actually teach implicit bias training within our organization. We've had expert subject matters to come in, and all parties within our department have had that training. And we also have individuals throughout the organization, sworn and non-sworn, who went through train the trainer type courses so that we can continue the curriculum. And I'll just use an example. Of course, I'm not going to remember her name because I want to remember her name. But you all would recall the show where America's Got Talent, and there's the show Britain Has Talent. And we can all remember the lady who came out on stage and sung with the strongest voice we can all imagine. I can't remember her name right off. But it was an example of implicit bias. They looked at her, they sized her up, and they mocked her, the entire audience, including the host on that show, only to see after can anybody remember her name?
It was in the chat, Susan Boyle, somebody.
Yes, thank
put
you.
it in there. Yes.
Susan Boyle. And of course, when she opened her mouth, she was a songbird, and they ended up apologizing to her before they entered their score. And we actually used that as one of many scenarios in that training curriculum. And part of that is the reality that race is huge in implicit bias, gender is huge in implicit bias, but there are so many other prejudices that people bring to the table. And so that course really affords our folk to pay attention and be self-aware and recognizing what their own biases are, because we know that we have individuals who bring that to the table. Our police academy starts with an ethics block that speaks to the socialization process of becoming a police officer. There's no place on earth that just populates police officers. They come from all walks of life. And they come from every economic, every socioeconomic, every demographic that one can imagine. And so coming to a law enforcement environment, they have to not only learn and know what their own biases are and prejudices are, but they also have to recognize the expectations of wearing that badge and the expectations of wearing that badge with honor, and understanding the consequences of when that badge is tarnished as well. And so then they get into the reality-based scenario type training, where the critical thinking plays a huge part. And that happens throughout our organization. And so it's not just a shoot, don't shoot scenario, but it could be a scenario where there's no violation at all, but someone called 911 and staged the situation. And that officer, that individual has to be able to respond with an understanding of, do you have a situation or do you not? And can you discern the difference? I've had the opportunity to talk with community groups, and I'll use this example where I had one to tell me a man had taken his car to the shop, drove his bicycle to the shop to pick up his Mercedes. A Black male drove through a community and advised that he watched officers go down the road with sirens on, and he wondered what had happened. And then he realized within seconds they had turned around and were approaching him on his bike. And he, unaware, didn't understand why. And the officers were responding initially to a burglary of a garage whereby a Black male had stolen a bike. And he was the perfect description of what that caller had given to 911 call takers. And so the officers spoke to the man. He dismounted the bike. And as he's standing there, you know, he's in that moment where he has to show proof that he's the owner. And he identifies the lock code, the combination on the bike, and the officers apologize to him. But how often does that happen? And the conversation that I had that night in that meeting was, how do we get to address the other side of that 911 call? Because we had a Black man riding through a community, and all of a sudden he has stolen the bike that he paid for as he took a shortcut through a neighborhood. And we've seen countless situations like this over the last several weeks. Central Park is another example. And I think when we talk about that trust, there are a number of people that need to be at that table to really build and heal our communities. The critical thinking affords an individual officer in training in that controlled environment to explain and articulate why they did what they did, how they came to the solution or the actions that they took. And then they have the opportunity to identify where the weaknesses were and where the strengths were. We know that it's not the controlled environment that rises to the level of what we're seeing here across our country. It's those realities that have come to life, have been exposed by cameras and body-worns and video and everything else that tells us that there is still more work to be done. When we talk about those departments, 18,000 departments, that's a lot of law enforcement agencies in this country. But there again, when the resources are not there, the training is very different. You know, what I have been able to offer and train and teach some of our departments, as well as several other major cities. But then again, you could find that one bedroom community that is very progressive with their leader, and they too have maxed out on opportunities for training in these critical areas. But across the board, there's a huge difference between one agency and the other in terms of what we're exposed to and how we respond. I think we have to, as leaders within law enforcement, we have to continue to expose our folk to those opportunities where we can do better. It has to be not only a policy change, but it has to be a philosophy.
Yep.
It has to be the way that we do the business of policing throughout the country.
Mm-hmm. Organizational and cultural changes.
Yes.
As well. Chief Deck Brown and John Monahan, we are 5 minutes over our time. For the attendees who stuck around, and I just want to say that I think nearly everybody has stuck around because it was an excellent conversation, and we really had some excellent insight from both of you, and I thank you so much for agreeing to come and share your experience and your expertise with us. But I want to say that we have recorded this webinar, and that can be made available for people who have requested it, or we'll be posting it on our website, the Public Safety Leadership and Administration Program website at the University of Maryland, so you can find it there as well. And just as we sign off here, I just again want to thank you, and I just thank all of the time and energy, because that's what it takes. It takes time, energy, and actually doing something, I think, to help communities all over the United States and elsewhere heal, but also implement some of those really difficult changes so we can become better on the other end of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take care, Chief. Thank you.
You too. Thank you.